Okay, this is going to be our next part on the 20th New York State Militia at Gettysburg. And we just talked about the 20th New York State Militia, their retreat from Seminary Ridge. And you can see the tower of the chapel now. The actual cupola of the Lutheran Theological Seminary would be over here. They began to retreat. We said that they crossed into the railroad cut by the Elias, or otherwise known as Carrie Sheed's house, and then entered the cut. And once they entered the cut, they began heading in this direction. Now, at the time of the Battle of Gettysburg, on July 1st of 1863, the railroad cut was just that, a cut. There were no tracks, no roadbed. It was simply a trench that ran east to west through the western part of Gettysburg. There were only a few buildings that stood along the Chambersburg Pike in this direction. Of course, there was the Lutheran Theological Seminary back over here, and then of course the Gettysburg College. The railway cut was excavated in 1853 for a planned railroad. In 1858, the Pennsylvania Railroad built the Gettysburg Railroad Depot near the town diamond. Now, the original plan was in 1830. It was called the Tapeworm Railroad, or the Gettysburg Railroad. Now, I'm going to stop with that for just a minute. We're going to look here to the right, and you're going to see today what is the site of the Gettysburg Post Office. And I'm behind the post office now here shooting this video. On that site in 1863 was the J. Tate House. And I'll try to send you a picture or post it on this video of the Tate House, because the Tate House was a house that obviously the 20th New York State Militia would have passed by on their retreat, along with the rest of the Union Army on July 1st of 1863. Also in the distance here you can see the chapel here at the Gettysburg College, and then just to the right you can see the American flag flying, and that is the flag that flies atop of the original dorm of Pennsylvania College. And as I said in a few minutes ago in a video, there were just a few structures that stood between the Lutheran Theological Seminary in this area. Of course, the Lutheran Theological Seminary, the Elias Sheed's, or otherwise known as Carrie Sheed's house. Then, of course, there was the Tate House, which sat on the site of today's Gettysburg Post Office. And then, of course, one of the buildings that remained and still remains to this day was the Gettysburg College, which was then called Pennsylvania College Old Dorm. And when we pass by over here in a minute, and I can see it, I'll point it out to you. And of course that building still stands today. The cupola that was used by Union Signal Corpsmen, and it was actually used by Major General Robert Edward Lee to view the battle on the first day. Anyway, back to the railroad. And again, this area was very open. Anything north of the tracks here was pretty empty back then. The college complex was much smaller. A lot of these trees were not here. Of course, just over here to the right, you can see a modern building, which is the Creek Side Apartments. It's an old warehouse that they make into apartments. Of course, that wasn't there at the time of the battle. That has made a huge dent in the landscape since then. But anyway, let's get back to the railroad. The original plan was from 1830, and it was called the Tapeworm Railroad. It was planned by Congressman Thaddeus Stevens. And in 1836, a man named Herman Haupt, who would also live in Gettysburg around that time, surveyed the roads from Gettysburg through the South Mountain Gap all the way down to the Potomac River. And the bed was graded for several miles up to Monterey Pass. So as we stated before, the railroad tracks that we're walking on today, which the Union Army was retreating on, were not here. The ground at this point was graded west all the way to Monterey Pass, but there was no roadbed or tracks at that time. This has been our next part on the 20th New York State Militia here on Gettysburg Battlefield. Okay, this is going to be our next part of our continuing series on the 20th New York State Militia at Gettysburg, and we're here in the railroad cut that the 20th New York State Militia, as well as most of the 1st Corps of the Union Army, retreated on in toward the town of Gettysburg. Now, as the 20th New York State Militia and the rest of the Union Army retreated along this cut, they were being fired at from close range from the west as well as from the north, because on the north side, also collapsing, was the 11th Corps of the Union Army, and Confederate troops were 300 yards away at any time in any spot during this action here, in this retreat during the cut. Now, this was a desperate retreat in which just under 3,000 casualties happened. Now, that's amazing. That means that 17.67% of the casualties that happened during the Battle of Gettysburg happened during the retreat through and the fighting through the town on the first day. That's pretty amazing. There's 53,000 casualties during the 3-day action at Gettysburg, but over 17%, almost 1/5 of the casualties of Gettysburg happened during the retreat of the Union Army on July 1st, 1863. This answers a commonly heard question here by people that live or study the Battle of Gettysburg. Where is the battlefield? The answer is the entire town is the battlefield. We're walking on the battlefield. When you're in a business or a building in town, whether it's a current day McDonald's or a restaurant, you're on the battlefield. It encompasses much more than what is owned or interpreted by the National Park Service. The railroad cut also marks the northern boundary of the town in 1863. And as I stated earlier, most of the view to the north side of the cut was open fields. And that has to be understood in light, because the town of Gettysburg, which you see over here, this was the northern boundary. Anything south of this cut was the town of Gettysburg. There was very few houses and homes, and you know, the college building was one of the ones that was up there, and a couple homes scattered. But most of the north side of the track was vacant. And by the way, the railroad tracks that had been laid by 1863 was right about here, where you see the intersection of Washington Street. This train station here was built in the 1880s, and that would be the Gettysburg-Harrisburg Railroad. And we did a video on the Round Top Spur that actually went through the battlefield that you'll want to check out. But the tracks for the cut ended right about here, and then everything from here westbound was just a cut. This has been our next part of the 20th New York State Militia here on Gettysburg Battlefield Ultimate. Okay, this is going to be our next part of the 20th New York State Militia at Gettysburg here on Gettysburg Battlefield Ultimate. Now, the Mamasburg, the Newville, and the Harrisburg roads all came to a point just north of the railroad tracks. The Mamasburg came from this section here, the Newville would come straight on, and then of course the Harrisburg would come in this direction, but they would all come to a head right over here, just on the north side of the Gettysburg Railroad Depot, which today we know as the Lincoln train station, which of course was built in 18 58. Of course, this station here, the Gettysburg Harrisburg, as I said earlier, that was built in April of 1884. But those three roads came to a point, and I will post a map. Now, 11th Corps Commander Oliver Otis Howard, his troops that were under Carl Schurz and Francis Barlow, are retreating along a road toward the center of town. And a collision of Union troops is about to happen. Remember, you have the 1st Corps heading in the direction, of course, with the 20th New York State Militia amongst them. And then from the north side, and all this open ground over here where these three roads are converging, now you have the troops under Howard collapsing all right here into this area where we're at now. Now let's talk a little bit about the men of the 20th New York State Militia. Theodore Burr Gates brought 375 men to the field on July 1st, 1863. About 70 of those men were temporarily lost in the morning of that day when they, as skirmishers, were separated from the regiment at the Emanuel Harmon farm. And if you go back and watch our earlier posts, you'll see exactly what happened. They would receive a few casualties themselves, and the remainder of those men would not reunite with the rest of the regiment until the evening. Counting those 70+ men separated, and the wounded and missing from McPherson's and Seminary Ridge during the early stages of the battle, along with the dead, and you have between 225 to 250 men left, and it's still July 1st, 1863. This has been our next part of the 20th New York State Militia, the retreat through the railroad cut here on Gettysburg Battlefield. This is going to be our next part of the 20th New York State Militia at Gettysburg on Gettysburg Battlefield Ultimate. Now, as the men of the 20th New York State Militia got close to the town of Gettysburg, they continued to fire, retreat, and repeat this over and over again. In other words, they're retreating, then they're turning around and firing at the enemy again, which is at 300 yards or less away from them. They also got fighting, retreating, and melee going on here to the north, and it's all converging in this area here. Now, Captain John D.S. Cook reminisced, and I quote him, "As I neared the town, or rather a road leading to the right from the one in which I came in on, at this corner the air was filled with shouts of 1st Corps, this way, 11th Corps, this way." Again, the area here that we're in is where these 1st and 11th Corps troops were converging on. The Union Army, who had been reorganized by General McClellan with corps badges, was now trying to make the best of a hasty retreat by keeping the corps together in order. Several men, including Captain Cook, went too far and soon found themselves intermingled with the 11th Corps soldiers. And of course, here is the Gettysburg Railroad Depot here, built in 1858. And this area here is where the 1st and 11th Corps converged. Most of the 11th Corps, collapsing from the north, would actually come into this area down what is today North Stratton Street. And of course, here is today Carlisle Street, which was the Newville Pike. Remember I said the three roads all converged? The Mamasburg Road came down here. The Newville Pike came right here. And then, of course, the Harrisburg Road came here. And they all converged right here at the train station, which we know today as the Lincoln train station. It does appear that possibly Captain Cook and some other members of the 20th New York State Militia may have actually passed right by this train station, and they may have even went one road too far to North Stratton, which at that time of the battle was called Stratton Street, and they may have even got intermingled with the 11th Corps soldiers before figuring it all out, and everybody retreating southbound through the town diamond, and then on to Cemetery Hill. And we will look at that section of retreat in a later video as we continue the march and the movements of the 20th New York State Militia. This has been the 20th New York State Militia. Our next part here on Gettysburg Battlefield Ultimate. Okay, this is going to be our next part of the 20th New York State Militia here on Gettysburg Battlefield Ultimate. And it was in this area right here, with the 1st and 11th Corps troops converging on one another, that things began to get a little jumbled up. Of course, the Corps badges were in effect so people could see whether they were members of the 1st Corps and 11th Corps as these Union troops. The orders are now being given to head toward the southern end of town and to a little hill beyond, which we would later know as Cemetery Hill. And again, according to the writings of Captain Cook, as well as other regiments and other soldiers in different corps, things did get mixed up in this area, and the 11th and 1st Corps troops jumbled together, all mixed up, began to head south, basically upon the Newville or the Carlisle Road up here, and Stratton Street, which is today North Stratton. And just for reference, we're going to come out here to the end, and of course, again, the tracks were laid right here at this intersection, and they actually went to the Lincoln train station, and there was actually a track that went right behind the station. Of course, that also is the station Abraham Lincoln would arrive to Gettysburg on November 18th, 1863. So as we head up North Stratton Street, directly in front of us in the distance would be Cemetery Hill. So it's very likely that here and right over here, 1 block to our right, is where the 20th New York State Militia, the 1st Corps, the 11th Corps all converged. They got mixed up, some troops. And you can imagine these soldiers going down Stratton Street here in 1863 in panic. And of course, other than the house up here on the corner, these buildings were not here. There was a small house over here where you see the warehouse today, the house of Judge Russell. And actually that is the yard where the 11th Corps soldier, Amos Humstead, was killed. He wasn't killed and found right here today where the fire department is. He was actually in the yard of the Russell house. But you can imagine soldiers passing by here, and of course there were no houses here at the time like there is today. I'm sure most of these houses, which were built in 1912, that surround these houses, if they could talk, what they could say about the retreat that was going on here. In fact, let me go over here and see if there's any artifacts in the ground at this house. Any bullets. No, I don't see any. Maybe they have a little information inside. Hello? I'm taking a detour. I'm doing a video of the 20th New York State Militia, Gettysburg. Is anybody home? Ah, heck with it. Let's do it. Hello? Hello? Anybody home? This is Gettysburg Battlefield Ultimate here, doing a video. Need some information. Oh, here's a book. And maybe we could find a book with some information on the 20th New York. Nope, doesn't appear to be anybody home, so let's continue on our journey here. So again, the troops are now heading back towards Cemetery Hill in the distance. And of course they would all be converging this area, panic, firing as they go, and we're going to learn in our next video as they go through the town of Gettysburg. Of course, the Swope house was right here. That was here during the battle, as well as the station behind it. But as the troops would go through the town, they would reminisce about cannonball shells hitting different buildings. And of course, down here on Stratton Street, down past the railroad tracks on the other side, there is 2 houses that do have artillery damage in them. So again, this was one of the hotbeds of the retreat of the 1st and 11th Corps, including the 20th New York State Militia here on July 1st, 1863. This has been the 20th New York State Militia on Gettysburg Battlefield Ultimate.